Now there's two approaches you could take to try to reduce that problem. One would be to slow down demand. But remember, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because that's what's pushing us up that red line. The same things that are causing growth and inequality are the same things that are pushing us up that red line. So slowing demand doesn't seem like a very good alternative. The other way to look at the world is to say, look, we're in a situation where the return to having a college degree is triple what it was in 1980. Premium for skills more broadly is much greater than it's been in the past. That's an opportunity to say, look, we have this situation in which if we can increase supply, we're going to get a bigger benefit than we've ever gotten. And that's a more effective way, I would think, to lower the growth, so slow down the growth in inequality. Now, there's also another side to it that I think people don't realize. Let's assume we have a bunch of people that are currently not reaching their full potential because, for example, they're not getting good education K through 12, and therefore they're not really prepared to either get college skills or other skills when they get to the labor market. And one of the things you always have to remember about human capital is it's a cumulative process. That is, the skills you build today build on the skills you already have. So if you fall behind early, it's hard to catch up. But anyway, let's assume you could improve the educational opportunities for a subset of them, say a third of them. That is 2/3, the system's hopeless, you can't help them. But a third of them you could help. What would that do? Well, first off, that third would get that big return we've been talking about so far. That way they would be able to capture, a much higher return to investment than we've gotten historically in education. That'd be great for them. What would happen to the other guys? Well, the other guys, their wages would rise too. Why would their wage rise? Because there'd be less supply of low-skilled workers, which would push up the wages even for the people who didn't get improved skills by shifting the supply and demand balance. So that kind of has this kind of a broader benefit than you would see based simply on the people you help directly. Now, there's a whole nother side to inequality that is interesting to me that's happened also. So let me go on. So one of the things that happens when supply doesn't keep pace, we see that prices rise, and then supply starts to respond in other ways. So how does supply respond if you can't produce more college graduates? Well, the existing college graduates work harder and work more. You have too many people in the low-skilled categories, they work less. Supply responds on other margins, and that supply response actually exacerbates inequality because you got more hours and more effort for the high-skilled workers who are already earning more, and less effort, less hours at the low end where they're already earning less. Unless you think this isn't a big deal, I'll show you a couple pictures. This is hourly hours per week worked. This is, again, percentiles. This is what it was in 1970 to 72. Basically very flat with higher hours at the very top. By the time we get to 2010 to 2012, 40 years later, dramatically upward sloping, where you have less hours at the bottom, more hours at the top. Everybody sees this. You just look out your window and you can just see those high-skilled, high-educated workers working hard, working many, many hours, less work going down and down here. That adds to the inequality we already saw because it's pushing down earnings at the low end, raising earnings at the top. That's for men. There's the picture for women. Pretty dramatic. Used to be very flat with somewhat higher hours at the very bottom and somewhat higher hours at the very top. Now it looks like men. Very, very high hours at the top. So the way I think about growing inequality, and I think you can view it in a supply and demand picture. The demand side is really the economic growth engine, which not only makes real incomes rise overall, but constantly raises the demand for high-skilled workers relative to low-skilled workers. That's the history of economic growth. So that demand side, rising demand for high-skilled workers, kind of built into the growth engine. At the same time, you don't have to have inequality growing. Inequality will either grow or decline depending on whether supply grows faster or slower than demand. If you get supply growing fast enough, like it did in the 70s, and it did actually through most of the 20th century, we didn't really have rising inequality because supply was growing fast enough. Supply grows more slowly, then prices really start to rise. As prices rise, this kind of effect kicks in, and that exacerbates what's happening with prices. That is, those whose prices are rising work even more, so that even increases their earnings even more. Those whose prices are falling work less. That even increases inequality in that dimension as well. So what's the policy issue here? I think one of the big problems where we've fallen short is producing skills. And I've talked about the world in terms of education. I don't want to make you think that education is the only skill out there. The answer is education is only one of many skills. But we know that rising premiums is not just about education. It's rising premiums within education levels as well. And so why do economists tend to focus on education? Because it's the easiest thing to measure. That's why we focus on it. It's, how many years of schooling you have? Did you graduate from college? Now, anybody who's ever had to hire people realizes there's a lot of difference among the college graduates. It's hard to ask them questions that tells you who's the good ones and who's the bad ones, right? That's why it's hard to hire, because it's hard to know who's good or who's bad even after you talk to them, okay? But education is something we can measure. So I don't want you to think education is the whole story. This is really a skill story more broadly. Education is just the one we can focus on and measure the easiest.